Very nice to be here. Thank you so much, Steve, for that very nice introduction. Like Steve mentioned, I'm a journalist. My background is in journalism. And I've found myself focused on issues that ultimately get down to our health. And but I write about it from some somewhat different perspective, probably, than some of the people here. I really enjoyed that last talk that we heard. It's amazing that doctors were never forced to take a class in nutrition on the basic principle that whatever you eat goes into your body. What an amazing revelation. I kind of look at things kind of systemically, and I do want to say one thing. I realized now that I've been at this for a while, thinking about my own motivation, since it's been several decades since I've been working on the range of environmental topics and essentially how they register on our health and our quality of life. And I realized that this has a lot to do with the idea of, and I'm just going to put this out there for a minute, between the difference between fate and intentionality. And we all know, actually, given that we're here at a health conference, that fate can deal us a very difficult blow. And it can deliver to our family members and those we're close to very difficult circumstances, whether it's health or other kinds of questions. That is the hands of fate, the act of God, if you want to put it in those terms. Those are things we have very little control over. However, there is a whole spectrum of other events that happen to us that are completely avoidable, that don't need to be happening, that we do not need to be subjected to, because actually it's the acts of man, meaning humankind, women too, who can create situations that are profoundly unhealthy to ourselves, to us, to our ecosystems that we rely upon for a healthy and vibrant life. And so I realized that actually this is ultimately, number one, what I've been writing about for the last 20-some years. Like Steve mentioned, I have 3 books out within the last 10 years. The first one was on toxic chemicals, the impact of toxic chemicals on the body, and what the implication is when the European Union, right across the Atlantic Ocean from here, began to take measures to restrict and eliminate many, many toxic substances from everyday life in Europe, while at the same time the United States was doing very little. So as a result, we here, you, me, all of us, are routinely exposed to toxic substances that are banned in the European Union, that our counterparts across the water are not exposed to. This, I think, is a profound shift. And also, by the way, the industries that do chemicals and various substances are actually doing fine. So the notion that this is bad for economic development, I also pursue very deeply in this book. It's called Exposed. The next book was The End of Stationarity, which is essentially about how climate change is altering conditions for us here on Earth, which have a whole array of implications on our ecosystems and ultimately on our health. And so I want to follow some of these threads, both of these threads, because they're actually all related, as Steve said, and they certainly are all related in my mind, because once you begin to actually talk about climate change, you begin to actually see the profound changes that are underway in the world now, right now, and what the effects of those changes are on our food system. So in this book, The End of Stationarity, let me explain what the end of stationarity is, and that will get us to our seeds. The seed book, by the way, is, I wish it was right here, ready to have for you, but it took a little longer to finish than I anticipated, and it's actually coming out in June. So I have a mailing list. I'm happy to let you know when it actually hits the stores. But I'm going to meet with my editor next week in Manhattan to go over the exact plan of action. And it follows in a direct line from The End of Stationarity. Here's why. Let me tell you something about what what I found. I put kind of this in context because we're ultimately going to land in seeds and food that we all eat. But about 7 years ago, a team of water scientists, hydrologists, amazing hydrologists, and actually they're even more specific, called geohydrologists, who study the kind of formation of the earth and its relationship to water, and who also study water, how it flows from the clouds onto the earth and what the impacts of that are. So this team of water scientists, one of whom is from the U.S. Geological Survey here, just not far from here in Maryland, began going back over thousands and thousands of years of data about water in the atmosphere, the moisture in the atmosphere falling down as rain. And one of the things they realized, to their great astonishment and alarm, was that the past patterns of water behavior in the atmosphere no longer provided an indication of what the future would be. This was an amazing discovery. So, for the first time, a bunch of water scientists realized that by understanding the past, you could no longer predict the future. This finding was later delivered in a paper in a very esteemed scientific journal called Science. And that paper had the title, "Stationarity is Dead." Now, first of all, I read a lot of kind of scientific journals, and you rarely get any decent headline. They're usually like 15 words long, and you only barely understand 3 of them. And in this case, you had a 3-word headline, "Stationarity is Dead." The reason I want to make this point and emphasize it is, one, it became the title of course, my book, The End of Stationarity. But more importantly, why, is that stationarity is a principle from the sciences, in which, and if you look at earth scientists, water scientists, wherever you're going to find science, you find a range of variability that you're able to identify over over a long time span. And that variability is actually known as a state of stationarity. It's the stationariness over time of a particular set of conditions. And so they've come to call it that. Scientists will call this stationarity, which is a way of measuring change. So then you throw something new into the mix and you see how it changes from this era of stationarity. Well, guess what? These scientists, who are a bunch of kind of water scientists, spend their days kind of measuring water and looking in beakers and checking out graphs and stuff like that, said, oh my God, there's no more stationarity. It's all like askew and it's completely unpredictable, and the patterns of water are just an incredibly volatile state, a volatile state that was actually very disturbing to them to discover. And they wanted to send out an alarm to the world by or certainly other scientists, by titling their paper, "Stationarity is Dead." So when we talk about what the impacts of stationarity are, that means water is not falling in the ways that it used to fall, right? Because it's not falling in ways that it used to fall, well, simultaneously, the heat is rising, as we know from climate statistics, which is completely clear. One of the effects of this is, number one, there's less rain falling, but there's more evaporation. What happens when there's more evaporation? There's more water going into the sky, right? And when the water goes into the sky, it sits, and it doesn't rain because it's not moist enough up there, but all the water gathers over time and comes down in huge downpours, which is why we have a strange combination of actually less water flowing in the way that it used to, and more of it flowing in extremely intense downpours, which is why we get floods and extreme weather conditions, which God knows you are familiar with here in New York, with Sandy, etc. So this level of uncertainty has huge implications for society. This is what I write about in The End of Stationarity, because in a sense, it's meant that there is no more stationarity, there's no more sense of predictable behavior, also in the realm of politics, in the realm of economics, in a whole array of spectrum, across the spectrum of modern society. Now we get to this, so we have this high uncertainty in the amount of water that's fallen, we have the rising temperatures, and we get the more extreme conditions. This is what's transforming our world right now. That's what's known as climate disruption. And so it takes us to our food. So what are the 3 ingredients you need to grow food? Thank you. I heard a sun. Thank you. Yeah, you need that too. Well, you need CO2. Yes. The air exchange with photosynthesis. Yeah, hydroponics. You got all 3 right, but then anyway, hydroponics is a system for delivering water. You can obtain water in all sorts of ways, through irrigation, through rain, etc. But anyway, all of you got it. So glad to know you have the basics of growing food, which is of course water, sun, soil. Well, the conditions in all these 3 ingredients are changing profoundly right now, and which is actually creating a serious challenge in the way we've grown food in the past. So all 3 ingredients that are critical to growing food are changing in a very profound way. So the question about what that means for our food system is a question that's actually being asked right now in food-growing areas across the world. And that includes, for example, the conditions that I described are very vivid and notable from southwest China, which is a big food-growing area, to northern Africa, food-growing area, southern Europe, Italy, southern France, and of course, not that far from home, here in the United States. I went to a couple places to find out what the future of agriculture looks like. First stop, Arizona. So has anybody been to Arizona in the summertime? Okay. Well, one thing you could say is it's... Thank you. So Arizona is hot as heck, as we know. They're actually, in fact, Arizona has the quickest rate of increase of 100-degree or more weather in the United States. The Phoenix area, which it's skyrocketing. As you know, the airport was shut down last summer because it was so hot. Arizona happens to be a portrait of the future of agriculture. So if you want to get a picture of what the world is facing and what key food-growing areas are facing, go to Arizona, which is what I did. And in researching the book on seeds of resistance. And what's interesting about about Arizona is, number one, I came to appreciate the beauties of the desert. I mean, the gorgeous, in what looks like a stark landscape, beautiful, strangely shaped cacti and lizards skittering along, wildflowers that burst out seemingly out of nowhere. And yet you're driving along on this kind of strange, seemingly strange, if you're not from the desert, region, and you'll be going along, you got the strange cacti, and you got the endless vistas, and then suddenly you'll start, first of all, you start smelling something first, and that something is the mist in which chemicals are being delivered to various large farms, and soon enough, in Yuma County and other places kind of in the center of the state, you hit these massive farms, which are industrial agriculture at its apex. And here in the middle of Arizona, hot as heck, Arizona, you have one of the centers of industrial agriculture in America. Actually, it's the biggest grower of winter vegetables is Arizona. A lot of the winter vegetables you're eating here in New York come from Arizona, as do melons, tomatoes, lettuce, things like that, grown on massive scale in Arizona. And one of the things that is happening in Arizona is these farms are under extremely high stress now because they require irrigated water and they require a certain spectrum of temperatures. They can live with some heat, but the heat has been sort of breaking records left and right. So what you have are crops that have been bred to be dependent on chemicals to actually change the conditions in which they're growing and are not delivering the yields that they used to be delivering because of the extreme changes in conditions. The farms have also been drawing extremely large quantities of water from the Colorado River. And if you've been following anything about the West, which is where I live in California, but not on the Colorado, but anyway, it's nearby, the Colorado is being diminished, and it's actually reaching record-breaking lows coming in terms of the level of water there. So you have extremely high stress in Arizona on the industrial agriculture system. The similar things, by the way, are happening in the Central Valley of California, which is also a major breadbasket for the United States, and also which you're eating those foods as we speak, citrus and apples and all sorts of other vegetables from the Central Valley of California, which is also going through extremely high levels of stress. I visited a cherry farm there, and in Lodi, California, great song, Lodi, stuck in Lodi again. It happens to be a city, that Creedence Clearwater song. And Lodi happens to be the center of, it all seems different now that I listen to that song and I was in Lodi. Cherry capital of California, beautiful, gorgeous, go down there in May. You see all the, traditionally anyway, you've seen the cherry trees with their blossoms blossoming up in May. Gorgeous. Maybe you've been there or seen pictures of it. Very kind of beautiful and inspiring to go down there. Well, I went down there and I met a cherry farmer, happened to be the head of the Cherry Farmers of California, a major position, extremely savvy farmer and savvy business person because he represented the cherry industry. And he took me around his farm and he said, "Oh yeah, you see those beautiful blossoms?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course, you know, gorgeous." And he said, "Well, look at the rest of the tree." And the rest of the tree, you had in the bottom third of the tree, you had branches which you can't see from the roadway. You had branches of stunted edges of the cherry tree. In the middle of the tree, you had cherries coming out that were about half the size of the normal cherries, and at the top of the tree, you had kind of normal cherries. But there you had 2/3 of a cherry tree distorted. Why? By the impacts of heat and lack of water. Mostly heat, though, because guess what? Tree crops need to be able to hibernate in the winter. So it gets cold enough, even in California, December comes around, and those tree crops can actually slow their metabolism down so that 3 months later, when the sun comes out, they can burst forth and bring us all those beautiful cherries and blossoms. Well, the weather is not getting cold enough now to actually hibernate, essentially. It's probably not exactly metabolically hibernation, but it's a slowing down of the metabolism of the tree. So that's a tiny picture of the stresses that are happening in those parts of the country. One more thing I will tell you, and then we're going to get to the response to this situation, which I do want to get to. But I want to give you a sense of the challenges that climate change is presenting to our agricultural system. You have an emergence. What happens when it gets hot and new weather patterns? New diseases, new kind of pests are emerging. And I myself have gone to the Midwest now a couple times, and you see, for example, new flies that are called fruit flies, a certain kind of fruit fly, which happens to love wheat stalks. And that fruit fly lays larvae on the wheat stalks, and usually it gets cold enough in Kansas to kill off the larvae before they emerge into becoming flies. Very important part of the cycle. Every farmer knows about the cycle that they're operating under. So this amazing thing where the larvae gets deposited on the wheat, then it gets too cold, kills the larvae, and the wheat grows without a threat. Well, guess what? It's getting hotter in Kansas. Because it's getting hotter in Kansas and the Midwest, essentially you have the larvae is hatching into flies. The flies love eating the wheat. They're devouring the wheat at a very high level. I've talked to scientists at Kansas State that they're losing at least about roughly 10% of their yields, which is a lot of wheat when you're talking about these kind of farmers. So I'm just trying to actually point out to you the stresses that the food system is under. And by the way, I also want to include in that the performance of GMOs in the face of these situations. So far, I've not been talking about GMOs, just want to make it clear. But GMOs, which are being presented as kind of the things that can adapt to any situation, and et cetera, are also showing similar stresses on the yields that are coming out of GMOs, and also rising resistance from, number one, new pests they never anticipated, and the rising resistance from pests themselves that are developing resistance to the genetically engineered substances in those GMO plants. So, so what's clear is that the industrial food model that the previous speaker, many of the speakers referred to here in terms of the type of food that's being produced, is under extreme stress due to climate changes. And that industrial model, by the way, has been based on a very fundamental principle. There are a number of different principles, but I'll just identify one because it's worth keeping in mind, and we'll get into the response. Has been built on a very rapid and accelerating process of concentration of control over the industry that produces the inputs that are essential to the industrial agriculture model. So how many companies do you think now control more than 50% of all commercially traded seeds? Well, almost. You're in the right ballpark. 4. Thank you, sir, with the man. Sure, yes. Person with the crazy, that funny hat. Thank you. Yes, 4 companies. And of course, they are probably companies you're familiar with: DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, Chem China, Bayer, and Monsanto. And of course, when and if Bayer and Monsanto merge, you'll have 3. So those companies, now what's also the common thread between all 4 of those companies? Thank you, they're chemical companies. So yes, this is central to this idea of where we stand now. Essentially, you have 4 companies that are rooted in producing agricultural chemicals that are now the main producers of seeds in the world. Let's just sink in for 1 minute, because this is the system that we have here. So we have a food system that's literally been based on creating. I asked a representative of Monsanto to essentially describe to me the process by which the company is developing new seeds to deal with the volatility related to climate change. And her sentence was actually very revealing, I thought. She told me that, this is a quote now, quote, "We work to uncouple the farm from the environment around it." That was pretty clear. That was what's that? The quote is, "We work to uncouple the farm from the environment around it." It will be in the book when it comes out in June. But that is essentially her description of encapsulating essentially the company's approach. And I thought that was a very interesting way to describe this. Number one, it's extremely accurate. It is very, very accurate. And 2, and we can't forget this, it's actually been very effective. Been very effective to actually take the seed out of the environment in which it evolves and actually create an environment based on a combination of forces, including using chemical protections to protect a plant against pests, against fungus, against diseases in a particular setting, no matter where it is. You can produce and 2, genetically manipulate the plant, none of which have to do with the environment in which a seed is growing. So now you have, as a result of 4 companies dominating the seed business, what's also important to remember about what that means is that as those companies have evolved, and it's been about a 20-year process, they've basically been buying out a lot of local seed companies and taking out of commission local seed varieties that evolved in particular ecological zones and replaced them with these seeds that can be bred over large areas of land, and replace with chemicals the characteristics of seeds that might have been able to evolve in particular conditions. So that is the situation right now with the seed business, with the people who grow our food. I kept driving, actually, out of Tucson and when I was there in Arizona. And I went down to about 2 hours south of Tucson, and I went to a farm of a person who's one of the world's experts in desert agriculture. His name was Gary Nabhan, and some of you might be familiar with his work. He's been a visionary when it comes to desert agriculture. Of course, nobody was paying attention to desert agriculture unless you lived in, like, Oman or something, until like 10 years ago when everybody realized, oh my God, the desert is coming for us, which it is. Not yet Long Island, but who knows. So he's suddenly getting a lot of attention in his life and in his work. And Gary Nabhan has a farm down in southern Arizona where he is growing nothing but sort of indigenously grown seeds. He's got a whole array of crops that he's growing. He got money from the USDA to go do some experiments in these extremely hot conditions, because the USDA itself was past tense, was actually interested in what kind of crops would survive in these kind of changing conditions. And what Nabhan's found, number one, is there are a whole array of crops that can adapt to these conditions. Number two, they're all evolved in those particular areas that he's talking about. And so one of the things that's happened is we need to pay our respects to the people who've come before us, because what they're realizing in Arizona and around this country and around the world is that there's been renewed attention on native agriculture. Because let's not forget, native people were here in the United States long before we were, and they were growing food long before we were. And one of the reasons that's so important now, aside from just the historical principle of this recognition, which is long overdue, is that they have seeds that have evolved over thousands of years to deal in the Southwest with the particular conditions that are now common. So if you're growing food for 1,000 years in the Southwest, this is the oldest domesticated agriculture in America, is in the American Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona. Many of those seeds have evolved the characteristics that are needed to actually deal with this very, very, very stressful situation. So it's an extraordinarily eye-opening period for people's appreciation and knowledge of what's known as native agriculture, and that is basically happening in this country, and it's happening around the world. At the same time, you have new grains that are actually being studied in the Midwest, for example, to see grains that actually evolved in the Great Plains, in the American Midwest, that were here before the big companies replaced the local grains with the commercialized wheat varieties, which I think some of the discussion here is about some response of the gut to these kind of commercialized wheat varieties, the rise in gluten intolerance, et cetera, et cetera. And many of these things like quinoa and kamut and other grains are starting to come out of the Midwest, which, number one, are more resilient to the changes in these regions, and number two, are healthier, because they're not the same kind of processed foods that actually can trigger allergic reactions and other reactions that may be related to the food that we are eating. So you have this convergence of health and seeds together. And it's even gotten to the point where even the companies like General Mills and Kellogg's and other companies like that are beginning to see problems with the supply chain of the cereals and grains that they've been accustomed to using, and are beginning to change even their kind of mass-produced products to include some of these other grains that have been showing greater resilience. So what the ultimate growing knowledge is that in order to have seeds that are much more responsive to the conditions that we all face, number one, you need a diversity of seeds. You need, and why one of the reasons they're finding diversity is important is because in the face of these sort of volatile weather conditions, they found over and over and over again, this is scientific study after scientific study, the farms that are far more resilient to these dramatic changes are the farms that have a diverse variety of seeds. So not only is diversity good for your own health, but it's actually good for our agricultural system to have a multiple different varieties of seeds. So we need multiple varieties. Let me tell you one more story, which hopefully illustrates this point. Well, if it's not clear yet, the model that I'm kind of laying out runs counter to the model that we currently have, which is dominated by the industrial food companies. And let me give you one other example, which I think is very dramatic. Now just shift gears here for a minute. Close your eyes for half a second and imagine the city, which I'm sure you've read about, of Aleppo, Syria. And Aleppo, Syria, as you know, Syria has been going through a tragedy, deep tragedy over the past 7 years of fighting. One of the things that has been lost is this, that in the city of Aleppo, which has always been a center of agricultural research, there was a seed bank. And that seed bank grew some of the most important crops that's throughout the Middle East and North Africa, very important food crops, bulgur and wheats and barleys and multiple fruits adapted to desert conditions. The rebels in Syria took over that seed bank and protected it. And because the commander, and I was told this by somebody who worked at the seed bank, because he was a farmer, and he understood how important it was to maintain diversity in seeds. And many of the seeds he planted, he understood how important it was. Even at some of the worst days of the siege of Aleppo, the rebels agreed to keep the diesel engine running that would actually keep the freezer, the refrigerator cold, so that they could keep those seeds alive and vibrant. And that seed bank, which is affiliated with the United Nations, and its technical name is the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, ICARDA. And of course, the world is starting to pay a lot more attention to dry areas and to those seeds in Syria. Well, about a year ago, it was maybe 18 months ago, the attacks started intensifying. I'm sorry, it was about a year and 3 months ago. The attacks started intensifying on Aleppo, and the people who ran the seed bank, including the rebels who were protecting it, were first forced to flee, and then all the scientists who were working there, who came from around the world, by the way, were forced to flee. And scientists right across the border in Lebanon agreed to get those seeds and spirit them. They got the one highway, they got clearance to go on the one highway darting out of Syria and into Lebanon. And they took a van filled with boxes of seeds, and they threw them in the back of the van, They raced that train. They had to go to checkpoints from both the government. They had to go through rebel checkpoints, whatever was left, the government checkpoints, and Hezbollah checkpoints, because Hezbollah runs eastern Lebanon, and raced that van right across the border into Lebanon. And here was this incredible collection of seeds that came straight out of Aleppo, have now been planted in Lebanon, in eastern Lebanon. Hezbollah has agreed to protect this farm because Hezbollah controls eastern Lebanon. I haven't been there. It's hard to get into, but that's what I hear. I've talked to the scientist by Skype who runs this institution. And they've also taken him as backup to Morocco. So in Morocco, which is roughly similar climate to Lebanon, and in eastern Lebanon, you have growing the seeds of Syria. Now, why are these seeds so important? Well, do you remember from your high school geography classes the Tigris and Euphrates rivers? Yeah. So what happened in the Tigris-Euphrates River? Well, dried up, yes. This woman said dried up. She's unfortunately correct to a significant extent. But going further back, of course, this was the seat of domesticated agriculture. This is when agriculture began. This is when humankind basically started to figure out they could take seeds, drop them in the ground, add a little water, let a little sunshine come in, and boom, up comes food. So suddenly humans could stop wandering around. They could stop wandering around looking for animals to hunt or berries to pluck off a berry somewhere. And they could plant things, stay put. That's why some of the most ancient civilizations on Earth come from this Middle Eastern area. And so into this area, Aleppo's based in the middle of the Tigris-Euphrates. It's not literally on the Tigris-Euphrates, but that whole kind of fertile, it's called the Fertile Crescent. Remember the Fertile Crescent? Good. Yes, the Fertile Crescent is the seat of domesticated agriculture. And so those seeds now have adapted to the condition. They've had thousands of years to adapt. They've adapted to conditions that resemble what? Arizona, Midwest, different parts of the United States, different parts of the world. And so a quick understanding of what's happened to those seeds in addition to Lebanon, Morocco, shipments of those seeds been sent to Kansas. You remember Kansas where they're having the larvae problem with the wheat? Well, they've been taking these Syrian seeds. They've been doing this incredible series of experiments where they're actually testing the which seeds are the most resilient to these conditions. They're literally setting up. They have a greenhouse. They put the seedlings in a greenhouse. They let in a horde of these fruit flies, and they see which survive. And over and over and over again, the highest rates of survival by far are the Syrian seeds. Could end up being the Syrian seeds coming from Aleppo are going to save the American wheat harvest and save the neck of a lot of Kansas farmers. And there's a similar thing happening in the Dakotas where you've had, what happens when it gets hot and then you get a sudden downpour, one of these intense downpours? Fungus love to attack wheat right after a rainstorm heat. They're also bringing these Syrian seeds into the Dakotas. So if you need an example of why diversity of elements are important in this extremely charged time, those are pretty powerful examples. So quickly, this is part of the struggle. My talk is about the struggle for our food. This is part of the struggle that people all over the world are having to maintain a hold on the seeds that have been grown up in different regions because they show that they perform, they're able to adapt, and people and in many ways they are a far more steady and stable source of food than the industrial varieties we've counted on. There are now seed exchanges in different parts of the United States. I visited some seed libraries, and I'm sure you have some here in Long Island, where people are saving. I walked into a library in Richmond, California, which is not far from me in Richmond, and they basically took those old card catalogs, God bless them, from the days when card catalogs were in paper little tags, and old wooden card catalogs, which had been stuck in a back room for years when the libraries went digital, took those out and started dropping seeds into them. And farmers can now come in, deposit one seed, take out another seed, agree to bring something back in the following season with notes about how the seeds perform. This is happening all across. There are 400 of these seed libraries now across America. There are major efforts to try out with these new crops that are actually independently produced. There have actually been dozens of new small seed companies, each within regions. Here in the Hudson Valley, you have amazing kind of seed companies coming up along here, this very rich area along the Hudson Valley. And the Southeast and different parts of California and different parts of the Southwest, you have these kind of libraries and seed exchanges that are beginning to actually put up resistance to the kind of domination of this industry by these four companies. Essentially, to encapsulate the struggle, we have a time period of extreme volatility, high uncertainty, which are precisely the conditions which run counter to an industry of four companies that demands predictability. If you're a company and you're a massive global company and you're producing seeds for large quantities of land, over large areas of land, you need predictability because it costs a huge amount of money to develop those seeds and then back them up with all your chemicals and everything. So at a very time when we have the least predictability we've had, at least in recorded history, high volatility, we have a domination by four companies which require these very conditions. And so in a sense, when you think about the resistance that's emerging, and we think about the foods that people are talking about here, and the way that farming is done, just keep in mind that that is essentially the struggle that's going on. I like to think of all these people, and including yourselves possibly, as the kind of seed rebels of our time. So with that, I hope I give you some kind of taste of the dynamic out there, the connection of all three of these topics of chemicals, climate change, seeds. And thank you. I'd be glad to take questions. And I have some books. Thank you. So if anybody has questions, I'd be glad. Yeah. What can we do? Good question. Well, one is actually figure out who it is that's, number one, there are these seed exchanges all over. New York is certainly one of the centers. First of all, I'd find out if there is a seed library here, which you can go to. I almost guarantee there will be. What's that? Yay! Who is that? Fine. Hey. Cool. So you know exactly the point. Yes. Yes. It's the great public spirit of the library system. So one is, this is not alone going to do it, but this is obviously very important that people reclaim the seeds that have grown up in their areas and grow them out, see what happens. That's one thing you can do in terms of engaging. It's actually a very interesting process to realize what a seed is. The magic that comes when something grows is evident. So that is one. Two is, and I think if you're here in this gathering, you know the idea of independent food makers versus the industrial food makers. So I don't have to state the obvious about that. Although organic food makes a difference. There's not all that kind of chemical stuff on it and all the other things that could be affecting your health. And three, very important, and I know this is difficult in this particular time period here, but ultimately there's got to be systemic change. There's got to be changes that discourage oligopolistic behavior, which is essentially what we're seeing now to a great degree in the seed business. And more importantly, or equal importance, are the policies used for farmers need to come out and start supporting farmers who take an independent route. I think, it's difficult on the national scale. We have the Farm Bill. Obviously, a political situation is somewhat difficult. But here in the state of New York, you have a very big, you have a pretty big agricultural sector. There can be measures taken to encourage, for example, through crop insurance mechanisms can be used to encourage farmers to use strategies that actually enhance the environmental conditions of the soil rather than deplete the environmental conditions of the soil, which is a big thing. So I would kind of, and I'm sure there are probably NGOs in this area working on this. So the system, and then there's your individual.
Is there a health difference between fruit or vegetable with, fruit with a seed and seedless?
I mean, that has a seed or not?
Is there a health difference?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what it takes to create a seedless fruit. I've probably eaten both, but I think somehow I incline towards things that have a pit just because it seems like it's closer to how they evolve. I actually don't know how to answer that question. There could be, but I have no idea. Yeah, that's a reasonable. Yeah, sir, and then you.
How do you know if the seeds in the seed library are GMO seeds or not?
Well, that is a reasonable question. I think that basically, first of all, some GMO seeds are designed not to reproduce themselves, but not all of them, of course. And I think there's an element of trust here. I mean, I think basically there's, they look the same, roughly speaking, they kind of look the same. I think a farmer or a gardener who would bring in a GMO, why would they try to, there's not a law against bringing a GMO seed. You could try it and see, maybe it performs, I don't know, there's no law against unless the library advertises itself as kind of non-GMO, which I don't think they would in a public institution. That they can't be favoring one or the other. Yeah, so you can't say this is better than that, but you can just say give the opportunity. What often happens is the person leaving the seed will leave a certain note. I've seen this before, and it goes like, does well in fog, and plant in the spring, or but it wouldn't be high on my list of concerns. But I can't, there is no way to ensure that that wouldn't happen. And of course, there are not GMOs for every crop. Yet, but if you're going in there tomorrow, there's really very few, I don't think there are any GMO fruits, for example, yet, but maybe there are beginning to. And then, with that?
How long have these chemical companies been doing this? These four, they're chemical companies. Monsanto's with Agent Orange, with Vietnam, and these other ones, they're all chemical companies. They're in our food. That's not good. I just want to know when did it get that way? Because it wasn't always that way.
Yes, that's true. The chemical companies have really been around for a long time. They really got a big boost when it comes to agricultural chemicals. They got a big boost after the Second World War, the First World War, and then the Second World War, where the Defense Department tried to work out chemicals that they could use as toxic agents. And many of the chemicals that came out of those Defense Department programs ended up being adapted to farms. And one of the interesting things about the evolution here was that back 50 years ago, 30 years ago, the chemical companies were different from the seed companies. So basically, I mean, I'm not saying chemicals were any better back then, but the chemical companies were different from the seed companies. You go to a store, you have to buy a XYZ seed, and then you have to go to another company to buy like XYZ chemical, right? And what's changed in the past like 25 really, possibly 30 years is absorption of many of the biggest seed companies by the chemical companies. And that is very significant in a number of different ways. Most significantly, it actually means that the breeding of seeds is often done in coordination with the chemicals. So you are breeding seeds that actually are dependent on, they're crack baby seeds. They're basically crack baby seeds. So, and I talked to some breeders about this, and these are very traditional breeders. I mean, I went to UC Davis, which is a center of innovation for modern agriculture. And some very sophisticated breeders and such affiliated with UC Davis. And one of the breeders explained to me, he said, yeah, I mean, he said, if you're breeding, you can find what you're looking for. You just have to work at it. This is breeding, right? You go generation upon generation upon generation. You select for the quality that you want, and then over time you develop a commercial variety. Well, if you are not looking for pest resistance or disease resistance, you won't find it. This is, I think, the most important thing to remember about what this means in terms of chemical companies owning seed companies. If you're a chemical company and you already have the chemical that you think is going to take care of whatever pest or whatever disease, are you going to go look for characteristics that can actually resist diseases or insects? And so there's a lot of concern now among breeders and other people about the long-term implications of the kind of seeds that are coming to the market developed by chemical companies, which are breeding them to be dependent essentially on their chemicals. And that is, I think, the most dangerous thing, and it obviously has huge implications for our health in terms of the food that we eat. I think this gentleman, and then, did you have a comment? Oh.
Just to answer a question about the GMO seeds, most seed libraries actually grow the seeds that when they're given to them to test them out. They have large farms, large greenhouses, and they do test a lot of the seeds. Most of the GMOs are they don't grow again. They do that on purpose so they can sell, and the farmers have to buy their seeds because they have to buy their chemicals. So it's an enormous business. You know, it's all to make money. It's not to make us feel any better or be any healthier. It's a big money-making business.
Well, one of the other things that obviously there's a panel on GMOs later, and I write about GMOs in Exposed, believe it or not, back because there's a chemical quality to GMOs that's an issue. But GMOs, because they've been genetically manipulated from inside, and many of them are terminator, are triggered to not reproduce, they have a unique non-adaptability. They're incapable of adapting to the changing environment because they have been adapted from within. But when we think about seeds evolving over time and evolving to deal with the enormous volatility at hand here, there's one thing you could say about GMOs, is they have no capacity to interact with the environment that they're, I think that's, yeah, just to build on what this gentleman said.
Another little bit of information is over the past 10 years, over 10,000 farmers in India have committed suicide because they can't afford to buy the seeds from Monsanto and these other companies, and it's putting small farms out of business, creating large farms, and over 10,000 small farmers have committed suicide in India alone.
Yes. Well, there's huge expense, obviously. Inputs, chemical expenses can send farmers on a spiral. So I did say this gentleman, but after, I know you. Sir, yeah. Uh-huh.
Thank you. Are the large chemical companies that we're talking about, are they interfering, say, with the distribution of the Syrian seeds banks? Are they trying to negate their distribution around this country? Are they using their influence or their money or power to, say, squash this Syrian seed and ultimate food growing from the Syrian seeds? Are they trying to interfere with the food supply?
Wow, well, that is a great question. If I had the answer, I would probably go write it right now. First, I don't really have evidence to say that that is occurring. But there is a larger question here, and this is very much an issue globally, which is the seed banks, and there's the one in Syria I mentioned, now in Lebanon and Morocco. There are 9 of them, and then there are a bunch of smaller ones, but there are 9 really big ones that actually conserve the seeds in different ecological zones of the world. And so there's one in Aleppo. There was one in Aleppo. There's one in Mexico called Simit, which is kind of cereals and grains that evolved in Central America and Mexico. There's one in the Philippines, which is kind of Southeast Asia varieties. There's one in Brazil. That's for tropical plants. It's amazing, actually, when you look at it. It's all these different kind of seed varieties evolved in different regions, and they're different. And there's one in the United States, actually. The oldest one here is in Fort Collins, Colorado. Fantastic place to go visit if you ever go to Colorado, which has all the seeds, many seeds from North America. And there are others in different parts of the world, including India, South Africa, and elsewhere. What's interesting about that is because they're affiliated with the United Nations, they're technically open to the public. So, which means if you were a farmer somewhere and you wanted to get one of these seeds from one of these places, you could get those seeds, right, and go maybe plant them in your field. Well, a big question now is, are the companies, that we're going to continue allowing the companies to go in there and get seeds and then breed something new based on that material and then patent it and market it? This is a dispute that's actually happening right now in different, in some international bodies are disputing whether there either needs to be some financial compensation paid or some kind of provision paid to prevent this very precious material from falling into the hands of a private company and locking it behind a patent. So it's a great question. I don't know the answer when it's specifically around Syrian seeds per se exactly, but I do know this is a big question right now. And you'll see it in my book I write about it. It's a lot of elements that would be, it's a whole other discussion, but it's relevant. Yes, ma'am.
It's actually connected to your question. In terms of the rights of the people in our country and of the world, is somebody addressing legally, trying to draft laws or attempting to draft laws that give people the right to know what is in the food that they're eating? For instance, there are people who are wildly allergic to bee stings, and yet there are bee genes in many of the tomatoes that have been bred and are commonly marketed, and people don't know that they're eating genes from bees when they're eating the tomatoes. Is there a movement, are there people who have organized to try to ascertain certainty that people will have the right to know what they're putting into their mouths and the mouths of their children, etc.?
Well, great question. I mean, this is the fundamental principle of the labeling movement, and particularly when it comes to GMOs. I mean, this is like the, there's been effort after effort after effort after effort to compel the government to require labeling if your food contains genetically engineered ingredients. And I think it's the reason you just laid out that the health professionals endorse this labeling effort. I think the American Nurses Association endorsed the labeling initiative, certainly in California and Oregon. I don't know if there has been one yet here in New York. The effort to force the companies to reveal because of the health concerns. Because of the health concerns, you could end up eating something you're allergic to without knowing it. I mean, it's a very fundamental principle They've had to do with nuts. You know, they have to tell you if something contains nuts. I mean, that makes sense. So if something contains some weird gene that you could be allergic to, this is why the Nurses Association and other medical groups are pushing to require labeling. And as you know, we don't really have GMO labeling yet. There's this very weak effort to compel companies to offer that information through some phone app, which I totally don't understand. You have to go into your produce thing and scan your telephone over vegetables and fruits to obtain that information, but I don't even think it's implemented yet. So it's a legitimate health concern. Dr. Krimsky is coming tomorrow, who's an expert in this too. He's a medical doctor. And he's going to be speaking tomorrow on GMOs on this exact, and one of his issues is this question. He's a public health scientist. And his book is here too, it's somewhere over there. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I don't know a great deal about seeds, but I've learned that many seeds yield crops.
Apparently so.
That there are seeds that we eat directly, like chia seeds. So do you have any insights about these two types of seeds that you could share?
That's an interesting question. You know, it took me a while to realize, oh, right, eating a corn, you're eating corn seeds. You know, all these, I don't know if there's I don't know if there's a difference. In other words, eating a seed as a food, many foods are seeds. Many seeds are foods. Like a corn kernel is a seed. And corn, if it's not kind of one of these industrial produced corns, is actually very good for you. They live on it, you know, in Mexico it's kept people alive for thousands of years. So I think the one thing that's interesting is a diverse source of food from different sources, including seeds and obviously other vegetable crops. And I'm not an expert on this, but I think there's a greater understanding, and here some of the scientists I think are dealing with this question of the microbiota of the gut, which likes very much having a diverse array of sources to work with. And I think there's a deeper understanding of how the stomach works and integrates nourishment into the body. And so I would think that having a diversity of sources like that would be very helpful. Seeds are packed with, when you think about all the information that seeds are packed with, you know, they're tiny little things, but they've got embedded in them a whole genetic history of what brought them, it's like the rings of a tree. The stories are contained in every seed. It evolves from the earth in certain conditions, and it awaits this moment when it gets, the conditions are right to actually trigger this emergence into a plant. So I think having a healthy reverence for seeds is probably a good start. Yeah.
I have a question that's not exactly about seeds, but it affects everything that we're eating anyway. Fracking, right now in California, they're using fracking waste oil, you know, in California a lot, and it's like the Palm Company and the Wonderful, they're using fracking oil waste into the food, and then even in almonds. And it's not being, not that many people know about it, but if you Google it, it will come up. And there's a group that's leading the charge. It's Food and Water Watch. I'm with that group. They're a big group, and then she was just on it. The leader of that group was just on WNYC yesterday, so I just throwing that out, because I want to know my walnuts are clean, and they can't even know what the chemicals are. And pomegranate's supposed to be healthy, and Palm is using that now. It's a bad thing. It has nothing to do with seeds, but it has to do with food.
Well, it's funny that it actually, first of all, Food and Water Watch does do, you know, really good work. So it's it's funny. It was you know, because I've been doing environmental stuff for many years. I'm actually starting to see the connections between all these things, and what you're talking about very much has a lot to do with seeds, because actually it's the choice of what seed you plant that determines the system by which you're going to grow your crops. So if you're if you are in a if you have a large industrial farm that's, let's say, several thousand acres, you have certain concerns. You just need to bring in a certain amount of water, a certain amount of chemicals, and you have chemicals that actually play the role of a plant's inner capacity to deal with various conditions. And so sometimes having these large-scale farms will actually, I'm not saying they're seeking fracking contaminated water, but the fact that water that is contaminated is making its way into those farms, which is true, and I live in California, I know you're right about that. That wouldn't happen on a farm where the farmer is actually paying attention to the sources of their water, that they actually have a clear understanding of where their water comes from. There's a whole different level of kind of attentiveness. And it starts actually with the seed. The seed will determine whether you're going to have a 1,000-acre farm or a 500-acre farm or a 50-acre farm. I mean, from the seed flows the decisions that relate to what you're talking about. What's that?
They know they're using that fracking water. I mean, it's like 200 chemicals in that. I mean, that was the Food and the Clean Water Act. Bush and Cheney escaped that. They're free from revealing what's in there, and it's like 200 different carcinogens in there, like benzene and stuff like that. These giant food agricultural growers, they know what's in there. They're buying it because they're saving a lot of money because the water is so scarce in California right now. So even though they can say organic can only be up to 70%, you have to be organic. And the other 30%, you can water it any way you want. They're using these harmful chemicals in there. And if you heard of that, these billionaires with the Resnick family, that own virtually all of the almond industry in California,
and
they're using this stuff, and it's Jerry Brown, the governor, is, crony capitalism. He's getting kickbacks on this, and he's permitting this. And I'm scared to get anything from California, including wine and all that, because they're using that chemical waste water to irrigate the crops.
Well, it's not all of California, but yes, parts of California have gone through this very abusive practice, and it's why we need a different form of agriculture. Well, we need a different administration. I've been kind of leaving out the elephant in the room because it's such a large elephant that it's actually, it's. What's that? Yes, they are. But what's interesting is that the previous administration, the Obama administration, slowly in the last 2 years of that administration, there actually was a bit of a change at the USDA. So they had very much the same policy when it came to GMOs, same policy as Clinton, same policy as Bush, no different. But in the last, essentially really in the last 2 years of the administration, there was a shift happening at the USDA. And one of the interesting things about that shift was that the USDA was paying huge quantities of money for crop insurance because these industrial level farms were actually not delivering yields. So you had actually the Midwest and big parts of the Southwest, California, big food growing areas. The farms were not producing in this environment, during the drought and during other forms of environmental stress. So the USDA just skyrocketed. The payments between 2010 and 2016 went from like $10 to $18 billion, creating a real crisis at the crop insurance system. So number one, as a journalist, I'm looking at that and going, well, that's interesting evidence of problems in this growing system. And two, it actually got the attention of people at the USDA who started going, oh my God, maybe we need to start thinking about a different kind of model of agriculture. And so funding for organic research did increase significantly in the last, essentially, 2 years of the Obama administration. And, of course, now I think I'm talking about another era, but in any case, the other interesting thing about it was, and this is still there, and you can find this, the USDA issued guidelines for farmers. It actually issued, like I said, the best way to farm, and this is the most productive way, and stuff like that. And I read that, and I actually describe it in this book, The End of Stationarity. I describe these guidelines, and then I reiterate them in this seed book. But what was interesting is they sound like they're like from some hippie farmer primer. I mean, they're all about basically increasing the amount of organic matter in the soil, ensuring that there's greater water absorption, much more diversity of seeds, relying on natural techniques to control pests, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, one, there was kind of a change, actually. The USDA, you could read this, and you can't believe it's coming out of the USDA, but there it is. And it actually explicitly, essentially acknowledged that this is the way to actually create resilient farms as climate change alters the conditions for growing food. So even at the Obama administration in the last 2 years, did start changing its approach, but we all know what happened. And that approach is not going to continue under the current administration. On that happy note, a lot is in your hands, so go out there and thank you, and I'll be having some books over here. Thank you. And I think we have some books here. I also have a mailing list. If you want me to let you know when the seed book is published, I could be happy to do that. Thank you.